Good evening, Adam, Dr. Frank, and good evening, everybody on YouTube joining us in our Cloud Zendo. Good evening to my fellow residents and friends who I'm seeing for the first time in a couple of weeks. I've been away, so it's really good to be back with you all. And Adam is flying somewhere over the North Atlantic in a space shuttle. What's it called?
This is the Rocinante from The Expanse. So bonus nerd points if you've watched the show.
Cool. And we're being joined by about 100 people on YouTube, and if they were filling the Zendo, it would be packed. So welcome to all of you on YouTube. Astrophysicist Adam Frank, this is so cool, is a leading expert on the final stages of evolution for stars like the sun. And his computational research group at the University of Rochester has developed advanced supercomputer tools for studying how stars form and how they die. So basically, Adam Frank is a superhero geek. And he's also a practicing Zen Buddhist who's really into koans. I mean, it's like, he's like, you know, we share some things in common, so you've taken it to another level. And for those of you who have never seen Adam Frank speak, I hope you did a double shot of espresso, because to keep up with him, you're gonna need some energy. So pay attention, everyone. And are you drinking coffee? That's not allowed.
It's Earl Grey, you know, very Star Trek, very Picard. So,
I mean, your bio is so cool. Studying high energy density plasmas, magnetohydrodynamic evolution of matter ejected from stars. I mean, I hope you can talk a little bit about that and dovetail it with Zen. We'll see, but the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So first of all, I want to thank Upaya for this opportunity to talk, to Roshi Joan, certainly. And also to my own teacher, Roshi Rafe Martin. So this talk is going to be sort of three parts. The first part is going to be what we used to call at the Rochester Zen Center, I don't know, maybe they still call it, a coming to the path talk, a little bit about sort of how I came to Buddhism and to Zen, because it's actually relevant for my main themes. And my two main themes are a personal perspective on koan practice, on the kind of koan curriculum practice that the lineage I'm in does. And then along with that is thinking about science and koans, because as it turns out, I mean, as a scientist, I reflect a lot on what happens with koans. And so, you know, they talk to each other for me in a lot of ways. So I want to reflect on that in this talk. A reminder, of course, is I'm not a teacher. I haven't been sanctioned to do anything, not in Zen, at least. So this talk is really about my stumbling through my life through practice. And so there's going to be lots of misunderstandings and lots of greed, anger, and delusion. And so, you know, after the talk, Roshi Joan or someone is going to have to follow up and be like, no, that stuff, no, forget that. Now, forget what he said, no. So, you know, but hopefully there's not too much of that. Okay. So I had to take notes. I have to produce my notes for myself on PowerPoint because I don't know how to do anything else except PowerPoint. Luckily, you don't have to see them. Okay, so let's begin with this coming to practice part of the talk. And for me, that really starts with how I came to science, which came very early for me. My earliest experiences with astronomy was when I was about 5 years old, and I stumbled on my dad's library in the living room. And he was a big science fiction fan, and there were all these covers, all these magazines, these pulp science fiction magazines, amazing stories and such. And they all had like a picture on the cover, a painting of, like, you know, astronauts bounding across the jagged mountains of an alien moon, or you know, walking along with magnetic boots along a spaceship. And I fell in love with it immediately. And I just, you know, that was it. I just knew that the stars was something I had to study. And so astronomy came early, and then physics came a little bit later, when I remember my dad giving me, it was thunder and lightning. And of course I'm scared. I'm like, you know, 8 years old. And he explains to me that, you know, thunder is really just because of electric currents flashing through the air, superheating the air and causing it to expand. And that's the thunder. And that experience of having something that was terrifying actually become beautiful once you know what it is. really stayed with me. And so that's when I realized it was astrophysics that I was interested in. And I sucked at math for a long time. So that looked like that door was going to be closed. But then by the time I got to high school and I took my first classes in high school physics, when I saw that math was just a language, it was a language for expressing certain ideas. And I really fell in love with math and saw through like proofs that there was a way of knowing something completely. And that's a theme for me. It's going to be a theme thinking about the koans as well. This idea of knowing the truth. I was enraptured by this idea of knowing the truth from early on. And, I also encountered philosophy early on. My grandfather had this book of like, the 50 great philosophers, which I tore through in my teen years. And there was this idea, in there, I think it was Socrates who said that, by thinking about things, you can understand them. And I was really taken by that. And I wanted the truth. And I had this weird experience, like a kid can show. When I was like, 9 or 10 years old, I used to build airplane models. I'd build these elaborate World War II, airplane models. And then usually I'd go outside and I'd set fire to them and throw them off the roof because it looked cool. But when I was building them, it was the absorption of building them. And I remember one time, putting it together, finishing it. And I, in my kid way, jumped from my desk over to the bed. And in midair, I remember having this moment, this feeling where everything fit together. I saw the whole plan. In an instant, I saw the whole order of the universe, or so it seemed. And I remember like landing on the bed and being like, whoa, what was that? And so I've been chasing that my whole life, that sense. And that is what, drove me into science. But so that was coming to practice or coming to science. But now we also have to talk about the other side, which is coming to suffering, right? Because like everybody else, I had my boatload of suffering, and that's going to be an important part of this story. So I grew up in northern New Jersey, in industrial northern New Jersey. My parents were progressives, were politically radical for the time, certainly. Well, I would have been called a pink diaper baby. And for some reason that I never understood entirely, they moved to like the most racist, anti-Semitic town of, Jewish, you could possibly imagine. And so growing up there was very hard. I was the only Jew in the entire town, or so it seemed like. So, now people are very, shocked by, the rise of anti-Semitism. But for me, this is not shocking. I used to get my butt kicked every day for being Jewish. When they sang the Hanukkah song, in class, you knew who they were singing it for, me. And then I'd have to get, beaten up after class for that reason. So, the town was awesome. There were I met a lot of great people, but there was also, it was, virulently racist. And my parents got divorced, and my stepfather was Black. He was the first Black state senator in New Jersey for a long time, and was a civil rights leader. So I had a big target painted on my back. So there was a lot of suffering when I was growing up. And then worst of all, my brother, who was 7 years older than me, who was really the only one who was really looking out for me, he died in a car accident when I was 9 and he was 17 or 16. And as a buddy of mine who's a Vietnam vet says, if you see death early on, he calls it seeing the dragon, and you're changed forever by seeing the dragon. And that was certainly true for me. That experience, just reordered everything in my family and in my life. And what was interesting for this story about this was that this suffering, in some ways, science did help me with this suffering. I used to have this big book of astronomical pictures, galaxies and nebula. I remember after my brother's death, just staring at those pictures, and they gave me some solace because I had this sense of like, look, the universe is enormous. Look at all these stars. Every one of these stars is a place. They have planets. And my story, my suffering, is just one story out of an infinite book. And somehow that gave me a sense of some comfort. I carried the suffering with me through, the teenage years into school and such, like everybody does. Everybody has their own version of it. But those twin poles of science and suffering sort of would define my first 20 or 30 years. My family being being progressives, we were atheists. And I remember asking my mom when I was like 6 years old, like, do we believe in God? And she's like, well, some people do, son, but you'll have to make that decision for yourself. And I was like, Mom, I'm 6 years old. That's too much pressure to put on me. So there was just there was no religion in my family. After my brother died, though, my mom began to explore alternatives. And she ended up actually in Siddha Yoga, which is, a form of yoga that was particularly popular in New York at the time. The spiritual form, not unlike Hatha Yoga. I mean, Hatha Yoga has a spiritual part too, but this was this was an organization that had ashrams and a guru, etc. And so, that was my introduction. I went with her to the ashram a few times, and I could appreciate what was going on, but it just didn't really speak to me. And it wasn't until when I was at college, I went to Boulder, University of Colorado at Boulder, and there was the Naropa Institute there. And I actually did a Shambhala 2-day sitting. And that introduced me to the story of the Buddha, the heroic. I was already interested in mythology via Joseph Campbell. And that heroic journey of the Buddha really resonated with me, which is why I was willing to do Shambhala training. And that was a pretty profound experience. I sat for 2 days, and, you sit for 2 days and it's your first experience of your mind, and, what a mess your mind is. I remember having the entire Born to Run album, and this is when there were still albums, track through my head, like even with the gaps between the songs, just because my mind wanted to do anything other than face itself. So that was my beginning with meditation, but I still didn't really do anything with it for another 10 years or so. And it wasn't until I was a postdoc in Minneapolis. I just finished my PhD, and I had a daughter, young daughter. So I'm, a young father. I have a family. I'm a new postdoc. A lot of suffering, a lot of anxiety about, is this going to work out? Am I going to be able to get a job? Jobs are very hard to find in academia, still are. And so I thought, like, oh, let's try. It's time to try meditation. Like, I'm really sick of my suffering. What can I do about it? So in those days, what did you need to do when you wanted to find something? You looked in the phone book. And so I looked up, meditation centers, and I found the Minneapolis Zen Center, very famous Minneapolis Zen Center. And I called them up, and they explained when they had sittings. And the remarkable thing about this is I used to go to the sittings, but I would just like show up 10 minutes late, and everybody's sitting, and I'd walk in and I'd sit for 10 minutes until like I got antsy, and I'd leave. And nobody ever said to me, like, dude, what are you doing? You can't just walk in and walk out when you want. I'm still amazed to this day that like nobody ever, called me out on it. So that was an introduction. And then for a while, I worked with a young Zen priest who had starting his own group. And I finally got a job at the University of Rochester. And I asked him, and I said, hey, is there a Zen Center in Rochester? And he kind of laughed and said, well, there's the Zen Center in Rochester. And so, so Rochester has, one of the older Zen centers in America, founded by Philip Kaplow, the author of 3 Pillars of Zen. So when I got to Rochester was the beginning for me. I really, decided I actually did the right thing. I went to the introductions, learned about the formats. And the interesting thing about the Rochester Zen Center is that it very much still does, but, maybe perhaps a little bit less, the real Japanese formalism. Was really, Kaplow really kept the Japanese forms. So it was very traditional, very, very much in terms of the rigor, just the rituals itself. And so I start attending, showing up at the right time, the morning sittings or the evening sittings. And my first experience with koans was I'm sitting there, doing my meditation, and it's very quiet. It's, 6:30 in the morning. And all of a sudden I hear ding-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling, and everybody jumps out of their seat and runs out of the zendo and up the stairs. And I'm like, what's going on? I thought it was like the Buddhist fire drill or something. It was just shocking. It was a Zen stampede, as I called it. And I asked somebody afterwards, I was like, what the hell was that? They said, that's Dokusan. They're, students are being called up to Dokusan to get in line to meet with the teacher to work on their koans, right? And so that was my first introduction to this idea. And the running was because you had to show your enthusiasm. You wanted to be the first in line to show the teacher your understanding of your koan. So that was my first understanding of koan practice. And of course, in my usually stumbly way, I didn't do anything about it for years, right? And it was only till years later when I was doing, or a few years later, when I'm doing a 7-day sesshin, I would go to Daisan. I would go meet with the teachers, either the Roshi Bodhin or the other teachers. But I never asked to do any of the koans. And it was only in the 7-day sesshin that Roshi Bodhin asked, said, would you like to start the koan practice? And I was like, okay. And so he gave me Mu, of course, where we all start, Mu. Right, the famous Mu. And the funny thing is, I'd heard about Mu, right? Everybody in the Zen Center had heard about Mu. And the funny thing is, the Zen Center, like anywhere else, you get a collection of human beings and there's gossip, right? That's the first thing that human beings do when they get together. And it was all about, well, who passed Mu? Hey, did Joe pass Mu? I heard Joe hasn't passed Mu. He's been here 6 years and he hasn't passed Mu. So, Mu was this very mysterious thing about who passed and who wasn't passed. And so it seemed really freaky deaky, right, to do it. And so in this 7-day session, so of course, Roshi presents it to me and is like, Adam, what is Mu? What is Mu? Gives me the koan. So I go off and I work on it. And I'm working on it for a few days. I actually don't go to Dokusan for a while because I'm working on it. And then I come back to him and, he asked me, what is Mu? And I started talking, right? And he looks at me very intently and he says, no, you must show me Mu. And I was like, what? Like, there's a test? I thought we were going to have a philosophical discussion, right? And so I just was utterly flummoxed. Like, what are you talking about? Show you Mu. I don't know what you're talking about. And that was really, it was so striking to me. And then pretty much that was the end of my koan practice for a while, because for lots of reasons, I actually, after that, it was still a good sesshin, but I ended up stopping Zen for a while and actually working with Alan Wallace in kind of a Tibetan tradition, doing shamatha practice, which was very useful. But Zen wasn't done with me. So I ended up eventually coming back and I started to work with Rafe and Rose Martin, who are, former members of the Rochester Zen Center. But Rafe had also worked in the Diamond Sangha tradition with Aiken Roshi. And Rafe and Rose had started Endless Path Zendo. And so I started, and I already was good friends with Rafe and I had a great commonality with him. He's a writer, a great writer, also, New Yorker, Jewish New Yorker, and very interested in myth. So for my first book, which was on science and religion, I had consulted with him quite a bit about that. So he's both a friend and a mentor. And so, when I started working with him, I wanted to start on the koan practice again. So now it was back to Mu for real. So now, this is the part of the talk where we want to begin talking about, my experiences with koan practice, because I know there's lots of different ways to do koan practice. And I remember a conversation I had at Upaya that, I think for you guys, you use koans in a different way. It's part of, in teishos and its discussions. But just, because of the way I stumbled through my spiritual path, I ended up in a place where there was, sort of the more Rinzai tradition of this formal practice, a curriculum, meeting with the teacher. And, it's my experience with that as a scientist that has just been so interesting to me. So with Roshi, Rafe, I begin the process working with Mu. And, so how does actually koan practice work in this formalism, right? So it's Dokusan. It's all about Dokusan. The bell rings, you go and you sit in the Dokusan line. And, the teacher will have given you beforehand or the Roshi will have given you a koan that you're working on. And then so when when the bell rings, you go in, you close the door, you're sitting with the Roshi, and you have to state your practice. What is your practice? Which means stating the koan. And then, usually it'll be, okay, show me, demonstrate your understanding of the koan. And in my lineage that I'm in, you begin with Mu, but then you do a whole bunch of preliminary koans before you get to the curriculum of the big books, like the Womankan and the Blue Cliff Record. So, so now I'm in it, and this, I am so amazed at this process of like this idea that you have to pass the koan, right? And particularly Mu, because when you start with Mu, you're like, what is this? What is it I'm even supposed to be doing? And I spent many months working on Mu. And I would go to the commentaries, because the koans in the koan books usually there's the case, there's a verse, there's a commentary, or there's a commentary and a verse. And so, you're exploring it, you're meditating with it, you're doing zazen with the koan, perhaps repeating a phrase or so, just trying to deepen it. But of course, you keep going into Dokusan and it's like, nope, no way. And it's both frustrating and enlivening in many ways as you're like, searching for it. So I want to read, this is from the commentary from Mu, because I think it's important. Okay, so for the practice of Zen, you must pass through the barrier set up by the ancestral teachers. To realize this wonderful thing called enlightenment, you must cut off the mind road. If you do not pass through the barrier, If you do not cut off the mind road, then you are a ghost clinging to bushes and grasses. You know, the evocation of that is so powerful, as you know, especially as you're trying to like penetrate this thing that is mu that you don't even know what it is. But then this last line, this last part was really important. For this, you must make your whole body one great inquiry. With your 360 bones and joints and your 84,000 pores, concentrate on this one word mu. Day and night, keep digging into it. Don't consider it to be nothingness or as being or as non-being, and don't think in terms of has and has not. It is like swallowing a red-hot iron ball. You try to vomit it out, but you can't. You know, that is actually turns out to be a very accurate description of what you're going through as you're working on this week after week, bringing the teacher your insight or your understanding and having it be like, no, that's not it. That's not it. That's not it. It is like this red hot iron because it becomes, you know, when it works, and this is the amazing thing about koans, you can't let it go. It begins to be part of everything that's happening in your life. So that last line really ended up being helpful to me. And of course, as with everybody else, eventually I was able to, you know, as Rafe says, you know, poke my finger through the screen, separating me and my life, and a little bit of light coming through, and I, you know, was able to see mu, you know, be able to become intimate with mu. Now, if you asked me what my answer was, I couldn't tell you. I mean, it wouldn't make sense. It would just be like, you'd be like, what? That's mu, you know, because everybody's got their own mu on a certain level. Everybody has to encounter this for themselves. And that also is the beauty of it. You know, there's this thing where you read stories about people having their, you know, their kenshos or their, you know, their moments, and people often, you know, the stories of them bursting out into laughter. And I had that exact same experience, not right, you know, when in that dokusan, but just a little bit after. And the thing is that was so striking, and this is true of all the koans, you know, when you start with Zen, you've got this idea of enlightenment, you know, it's this thing you're going to attain, and it's going to be special, and it's going to be world shattering, and you're going to, you know, you're going to hold on to this incredible truth that you never knew before. And in the end, it's so ordinary, right? This is, you know, you see this in 1,000 Zen stories and koans. It's so ordinary. It's so everyday. It's just right there. And that is so funny. It's just so funny because you put all this effort, this straining, and there it was, always right in front of you. And that is the great, great beauty of it. And the thing was that I really saw that the you know, the thing I at least can, you know, bring from my experience was the thing I really saw was that after passing through mu, I saw that the universe was really perfect in its generosity. Like the universe holds nothing back ever. It is constantly giving 100% of itself. And it's just us, and it's us and the blockage, the shield that we put over of self that keeps us from seeing that generosity. We have everything all the time. So, you know, that was an awesome experience. And but that's, you know, the great thing about the koan practice is that's just the beginning. And so I want to this is where I want to bring up science, right? Because they're the first link or contrast between koan practice, which is where you are given questions that have answers, and science, where you're given questions that have answers that you have to grope towards. Because in mathematical physics, you have this idea that there are truths that you're going to get, and they are going to be special and extraordinary and mind-blowingly different. And in that case, they really are, right? They are kind of extraordinary and out of it does rearrange, you know, sort of like a certain kind of thinking that you're used to when you come to them. But it's different, and in an important way, because rather than the dropping away of mind and body that occurs with koan practice, you know, the truths of mathematical physics require a lot of building. You have to like create in ideas and concepts, you have to build this incredible scaffolding that you climb up upon, and you have to carry the whole thing with you. And it may take 100 pages of mathematics to lay it out so that you can follow it. So like if you're trying to solve a problem like the collapse of a cloud of interstellar gas to form a star, you start off with these abstract equations, which you already have to have known. And then you have to know about the initial conditions, the physical setting, which gets mathematized and plugged into the equations. And then you have to transform these equations using difficult techniques to put them in a form where maybe you might have some hope of solving them. And then you have to apply known methods for solution to them, which may involve many, many transformations and steps. So there's lots of what John Donne would call, like mind stuff in its most abstract form. So it's very different, and it's what the similarity. I mean, it's not as whole, not even beginning to be as whole as koan practice, but it's got some interesting similarities. One of them is absorption, right? The focus, the kind of samadhi that comes from being so deeply enmeshed in a problem. I have this feeling when I'm doing mathematical physics, that I'm in this like bone dry desert of just, it's completely reduced. It's the most essential elements. And there is a samadhi to that. There is a flow that's beautiful about it. And you can only enter this landscape of mathematical physics by entering into this state of concentration. And the other essential point that's very interesting is that when you finally get to the solution, you don't just see it intellectually, right? This beautiful, now huge mathematical intellectual structure that has led you to the answer. You see it, as Shakespeare would say, you see it feelingly. You see it feelingly. And there's also a line in the koans, in the early koans, about seeing with your ears and hearing with your eyes. And it's a similar thing. There's a kind of circumspective seeing that comes when you have the answer that you've gotten. So that similarity is very interesting to me, in that, again, these are both ways to truth, to a truth about the world. But I would say that, science only leads you so far. And that's an really important point that I had to understand. Science is not a spiritual practice, but it can produce spiritual experience. And that was the topic of my whole first book. But that is really something I want to point out, that there's the part of the similarity between the koan practice and what I find in science is that science does have this capacity to bring you to that what Heidegger would call circumspective seeing, whole seeing. Okay, so after Mu comes these the introductory koans, as I said, and the introductory koans are interesting because they are just there to sort of now start to teach you this language of koan practice. There's a way in which koans are orienting you towards your own experience in this very weird way. So the introductory koans are, generally tend pretty short, just one or two lines, no verses and commentaries and such. And that's really where you begin to sort of get a sense of what this is all about. And you're going to be on this road for a long time. And so, each time, so here are some examples. Here are some examples of the introductory koans. So, enter a spoon. Pass through a tobacco pipe. Resolve the heavens and shift the earth's axis. Save a ghost. Now, each time I got one of these, I would be like, get out of here. Like in the beginning, each one is just so, they're absurd on some level, and I had to be like, really, seriously, dude, really? Like, what do you want me to do with that? Save a ghost? What are you even talking about? And Rafe was very kind always with me. He put up with my, my disbelief and like, well, what is this? But what you find is that there's a language. People have talked about koans as literary forms. There's a language here which is trying to orient you towards your own experience and to gain an intimacy with your own experience. And the introductory koans are really there to sort of begin to give you a sense of what that language is like, so that as you progress into the books, the rest of the curriculum, you're already kind of having a sense of what the lay of the land is. And each koan is pointing you towards really your own experience, right? And this is why the important thing so much with the koans is the demonstration. This is something I find that is so powerful and so unlike science, that I have to show the answer. I can't give the answer. I can't talk about the answer. I have to demonstrate my understanding. And I find that really powerful, right? Because it's your whole body. It's your whole body and your whole experience that you have to show. And I one time used the word performative. I was talking with Roshi Joan about this, and she's like, no, 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 it's not performative. And she's right. You're not performing. Really, you have to be there. The times that I have had the most connection to the answer to the koan is when I was fully there in the demonstration. I was the demonstration. I was not demonstrating something. I was purely demonstration. And so let me tell you what I mean by this. There's one koan in particular that really made, so I'm not allowed to tell you the answers to any koans. I can't tell you what happens in a dokusan, because if I did, I'd have to hunch it down and lock you away forever. That's the rules, right? Nobody's allowed to know what happens in dokusan. So so I can't tell you what happens in dokusan, but I at least want to, or what the answers are. But I want to at least communicate one koan in particular that meant a lot to me about the idea of knowing what the answer is. And so the koan this is still the introductory koan: stop the sound of the distant temple bell. Again, stop the sound of the distant temple bell. And of course, my wise ass answer, when I came back the first time was like, hey, you with the bell, shut up already. I'm trying to meditate. But that didn't get me anywhere. And so, I spent weeks and weeks and weeks with this, in Zazen. The way I would do it was just be, just in kind of almost doing breath practice of just stop, bell, just entering the state to see what arises. And I was on Dokusan line, going to see the teacher, and nothing sharpens your attention like being on Dokusan line, because you're going to have to present something, and so, sometimes you're like, I got nothing for you. So, your mind gets very sharp when you're waiting on Dokusan line. And I was just, in that state. I'd been there for maybe a half an hour waiting, and the air conditioner, right? I can't say that I heard the air conditioner. There was just the air conditioner. And there was this full experience of air conditioner, right? And that I just knew. I knew exactly what the answer to the koan was. And it was such a powerful and beautiful experience. And, I went in and I presented it, and it was like, yes. And it was just this, and it's this great moment because, the Roshi wants you to get it, right? In their compassion and their the reason they went into the teaching is they want you to see it. And so it's a beautiful moment when it's just like, it's right there. And there's that communication between you and the teacher that is so perfect. But often it's also a frustrating slog, right? So I want to talk a little bit more about this idea of the right answer, because often it's hard to get the right answer, and sometimes even the idea of the right answer is kind of frustrating and even angering. And this is interesting because I am a physics teacher. I have graduate students, and so I am training my students in ways that will, my student will come into my office, and we'll be talking about their problem, and sometimes I'll poke them. I'll be like, all right, well, go to the board and write down the shock equations. And they'll be like, like, no, come on, go up there, and I'm going to guide them. I'm not a jerk, I hope. But it's, come on, this is hard stuff. You got to know your stuff. You got to walk in here knowing your stuff. That's the rule of physics. To know anything is hard. To know anything deeply, and you got to put the effort in, right? Just like in Zen. So I'm used to this experience of like teaching somebody, of having them knowing there's an answer and trying to guide them to it. And in physics, we have this thing called the qual, which is to become in graduate school, to make it through to your PhD. One of the things after a year and a half or so of class is you've got to take these tests. And the test is like 2 days, 16 hours, 10 problems on anything in physics. And you have to prepare. I studied for 4 months unending to take it. And it was terrifying because if you don't pass it, that could be the end. That could be the end of, the dream of being a physicist. But for that brief shining moment, like when I walked in to that, take the test, I was on top of Mount Physics. I had my own personal understanding of the entirety of physics, which disappeared the moment I walked out of the exam. But for a brief shining moment, it was there. So I really believe in this idea of, and this is maybe one reason why this kind of practice works for me. I believe in this kind of thing, even though it can be very anxiety producing, right? That's why I think for some people it's, I totally get why, actually that's not the way I want to go through this. Because, there's times when I'm with Rafe and he'll, he's trying to help, he'll ask me, well, show me your understanding. And I'm like, and it's like, you're anxious about like, I don't know what you want from me. Like, I don't know what this answer is. But by staying with it, with the koan practice, usually some version, you usually get there, right? So it's a little bit more about that, about this idea of knowing the answer or working on an answer. Because that is the weird thing about it, that it's a spiritual practice where there is an answer. So one of the ones I want to relate, one of the koans I had a great difficulty with, which was Hoan's Beardless Barbarian, which goes, the case is Hoan said, why has the Western barbarian no beard? And of course, the Western barbarian is Bodhidharma, who has a beard, right? All the pictures have him with a beard. So it's like, typical Zen, right? Why does the guy with a beard not have a beard, right? So, so let's look at the commentary. Training in Zen has to be real training. Enlightenment has to be real enlightenment. Once you see the barbarian's face intimately at first hand, you have it. But when you explain this experience, you immediately fall into dualism. And then the verse. Before a fool, do not discuss your dream. The barbarian has no beard. This is adding stupidity to clarity, right? There's so much going on here. But just the basic case, why does the Western barbarian have no beard? I got the first version of the answer, but in the tradition I'm part of, Aiken Roshi apparently was like, the usual traditional answer is not intimate enough. And there's a deeper answer. And it took me months and months and months of just, sometimes I'd come into Roshi and I kind of love when this happens, and I'll present something and it's just like ring, ding, ling, 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 out. That's like so classic. Nope, completely wrong. And other times, I felt like I had something. The answer or whatever, the experience I was working with felt powerful, and I was learning things from that direction, and still it was the wrong answer. And that can get frustrating sometimes, because you're like, look, who came up with this answer? Why does this one particular thing that you got to do or say, reflect my passing through this point, this killer point? And I've had a few koans where I really did feel like that at the end, but mostly, as in this one, though it took me many, many months, that process itself, the koan itself, the process took me to places that were so powerful. During this time, I had a conflict with a worker that was very painful and very unexpected. And I was able to bring the koan to this and say, like, okay, how is this no beard? How is this having no beard? And so, it begins to color and flavor everything you do. And when I finally got to this, more intimate answer, it was more intimate, and it shocked me. It was shocking in a way that was very, that really, really opened, really was a really profound opening. So, so I guess I'm kind of coming to the end here. So, you may spend weeks on a wrong track, but you'll still learn a huge amount from it. And in this is the way in which koan practice is so different from physics. I mean, you'll go down wrong paths in physics and you'll learn from it. But, really what koan practice, because of this intimate interaction with the teacher, and then this requirement for each, because in some sense, all the koans are about the same thing. They are all pointing you to the same, basic absence of self, or absence of self in your own, in experience, pointing you just to the ground, the experiential ground of your own life in an intimate way. And words just, words will never, that's why you have to demonstrate it. Words are always just, finger pointing at the moon, but they're not there. And it's, everything you go through with the koan practice, and the anxiety and the tension that you go through contributes to actually the when you see that it is real seeing, So the interesting thing is that, most of the time this works. As I said, sometimes the koans don't necessarily resonate, or the answer is kind of like, oh, really? The koans aren't magic, or are they? Because when they are magic, they are such magic. This technique, I would hate to use the word spiritual technology, but somebody tripped upon this idea of like, oh, use these stories in this particular way. I'm going to write them down with a verse and a commentary, and you're going to have to answer each piece or reflect on and come back with an answer for each piece. Somebody developed that, and it's brilliant in its way. So I guess to sort of close up on this, I wanted to reflect on, science is a path to the truth. It is a path to a truth, and it can be, profound. It can lead, and it can be, as I said, you can have spiritual experiences from it. But with the koan practice, and what I find just for myself, that the koan practice in this way, I continue to be in awe of its efficacy, and so grateful that in my stumbling, that I stumbled upon this, because for me, with my background, it works so beautifully. So, I just want to thank all the ancestors, who created this. And like science, science has a lineage that you're part of. I can actually track my my student, who who were the teachers of my teacher, going back to like the mid early 1800s. But with Zen, this idea that there have been thousands and thousands of people who have studied this exact koan and had this same experience with this koan that you're having, though also not the same, because it was uniquely theirs. And I'm just entirely grateful to that. So I'll end there, and I thank you very much for your patience and your time. And
Thank you so much, Adam. Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
I'm also fascinated by some of the mysteries of science and how that's kind of related to the mysteries of koans. And one of the ones, like what's at the center of a black hole, is one of those ones that we don't have an answer for yet. There isn't a right answer. Presumably there is, but it's going to take more work to figure it out, if it's even possible. But I'm curious, because you made this distinction between the practice of science, looking for the truth, and spiritual practice. And I wasn't clear on exactly what that difference is. If the practice of science can give rise to spiritual insight or spiritual experience, you said, then what is the difference?
So I had a very interesting experience one time. So my grandfather, when he died, asked that I say Kaddish for him every year. And I happened to be in the Netherlands one year when, in my 20s, when because I was studying there, when it was the date of his death. And so I was like, oh, where do I go? And I looked up, there was a shul, and I went to the shul and I asked the rabbi, it was very Orthodox, if I could do this. And I, went ahead, and of course I don't know Hebrew, so I'm transliterating. And afterwards, the rabbi's talking to me, and he says, do you have, I see you don't read Hebrew, are you religious? And I said, well, science is my religion. And he kind of looked at me and he was like, nah. And what he was right about, I remember really that made a big impression, because that was before I'd started Zen, because a spiritual practice is a religious practice, and it has to have the fullness. It has to touch all elements, character, right? So much, it's not just sitting on the cushion that we have to do. There's the ethical practices. So there's so much to spiritual practice that is not just about the insights that you have. It's about, these insights have to be grounded in these other things you're doing to live a wholesome life, to live a life that is for others. And science doesn't have to have any of that. There's nothing in science about that. Right? There's nothing in science that will teach you how to be a full human being. It can lead you to insights about the nature of the world, and experiences also that are about the circumspective seeing, but it can't do the rest. And that's why it's not a full spiritual practice, even though it can lead you to spiritual experiences. So does that make sense?
Beautiful. Yes. Thank you. It's a holistic practice.
Yeah. And it wasn't built for that. Science wasn't built for that. It's not, so that's the interesting part. And so, I think what's beautiful about Zen, or about Buddhism among spiritual practices, Evan Thompson is going to disagree with this, but I do think there's something really interesting about Buddhism in its malleability with respect to science, that it has, I think, because contemplative practice is so much part of it, and contemplative practice is empirical, right? You fundamentally have to sit for yourself and to have these experiences, that in some sense, Buddhism is in a unique position to sort of have dialogue with science. I mean, I'm sure that's not 100% true, but it feels that way to me.
Thanks, Adam. Well, that brings us to time. Thank you so much for your talk. I loved it, and I hope we can hear more from you soon.
Thank you, everybody. Have a lovely night.
Thank you. We'll end with the four great Bodhisattva vows. Creations are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to transform them. Reality is boundless. I vow to perceive it. The awakened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. Creations are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to transform them. Reality is boundless. I vow to perceive it. The awakened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. Creations are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to transform them. Reality is boundless. I vow to perceive it. The awakened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody